Well, let's get you more reaction to the sentencing now. The Director of Accountability Now, Advocate Paul Hoffman, on the line. Good morning to you, Advocate Paul Hoffman. Firstly, your reaction to the sentence handed down this morning.
Yes, good morning. And my reaction is that this sentence appears to be inappropriately light, probably shockingly inappropriately, right? I imagine that the prosecutors will now be weighing the decision as to whether to go back to the Supreme Court of Appeal in order to increase the 6 years that Oscar has effectively been given. The parameters are very simple, really. 5 years were given for culpable homicide. The Supreme Court of Appeal changed the conviction to one of murder with dolus eventualis, and once there is a conviction of murder, the minimum prescribed sentence is 15 years. If there are substantial and compelling circumstances, that 15 years can be reduced. But to reduce from 15 to 6 in the circumstances that we find in the Oscar case seems to me to be unduly generous to Oscar.
Advocate Paul, when we look at Judge Thokozile Masipa's initial sentence handed down for culpable, that of 5 years, and we also take into account the sentence handed down today, I mean, do you think that there has been a shift in her outlook towards this case? Do you think that she's pretty much where she was when she handed down the 5 years?
Yes, no, it seems that the judge has really from the get-go has been sympathetic towards Oscar, and the fact that she has had her culpable homicide conviction overturned and substituted with a murder conviction seems to have made very little impression on her approach to sentencing. That 1 year increase is really, it's explained on the basis that she does find substantial and compelling circumstances that justify a deviation from the minimum sentence of 15 years. But with the best will in the world, I do have difficulty with the notion that reducing 15 years to 6 years because of the mitigation that Oscar has been able to adduce in the matter, and there are mitigating circumstances, but I don't believe that they are sufficient to justify so light a sentence.
Advocate Hoffman, what is the framework under which Judge Thokozile Masipa can actually consider the mitigating factors? I mean, to what extent do you weigh up what is compelling enough and what isn't compelling?
Well, the law is quite simple. In the old days, a person convicted of murder was in the hands of the judge's discretion. That was changed by Parliament because very often a lot of people complained that judges were giving sentences that were too light and that the deterrence to crime and the retributive aspects of punishment were not getting the attention that they deserved from the courts. So Parliament interfered with that open discretion in relation to murder convictions and said, if you find somebody guilty of murder, which is what's happened with Oscar, then the minimum sentence is 15 years unless there are substantial or compelling circumstances justifying a deviation from that minimum. So the judge really has to listen to the evidence in aggravation, which is put up by the prosecution service, listen to the evidence in mitigation, which is put up by the accused person, and then make a call as to whether there is a substantial or compelling basis for deviating from the minimum of 15 years. And in this case, the court has found that there are substantial and compelling circumstances to such an extent that the 15 years has been whittled down to to almost the same sentence that was imposed for the culpable homicide. I think that the Supreme Court of Appeal has a different approach.
In terms of the facts of the case, Judge Masipa also made it clear that she wasn't going to respond to the public opinion, as loud as it may be, that it has no role in this case, and the facts being on record. How realistic is it to have expected it to come to a different conclusion, given that on record the facts of the case have pretty much stayed the same, of course, barring the Supreme Court of Appeal decision?
Yeah, look, in relation to the conviction, the facts have stayed the same. It is the intention. Her finding was that Oscar was negligent. The Supreme Court of Appeal said, no, that's not the right way to look at this. We find that there was intention in the form of dolus eventualis. So a different crime to the crime that the trial judge initially found has been imposed by a higher court. And in addition to that, after the murder conviction in the Supreme Court of Appeal, the matter was heard back for the evidence that was heard in recent weeks. And that evidence was presented both by the accused and by the state in order to place further information before the court, now that it is a murder conviction, in relation to whether the 15 years should stand, which is the standard parliamentarily prescribed minimum sentence, or whether there are grounds for giving more than 15 or less than 15, depending on the court's approach to that extra evidence that has been placed before it, and its assessment of the cogency and the substance and compellability of that extra evidence. What we have here is Judge Masipa changing a 5-year sentence for culpable homicide to a 6-year sentence for murder, and justifying it on the basis that there are substantial and compelling circumstances that justify the light sentence that has been imposed. And I think it's quite possible that a different court will take a different approach to it, and that on appeal, the prosecution service will be able to persuade the Supreme Court of Appeal that the sentence imposed is shockingly inappropriate and that it ought to be increased. As far as the public is concerned, what courts are always obliged to take into consideration is that if they give such light sentences that the public is so outraged that it then takes the law into its own hands, a recipe for anarchy is being created. While I was waiting to come onto your show, I was listening to the radio, and a lot of people calling in were scandalized by the lightness of the sentence, and certainly one or two of them said, doesn't this bring the law into disrepute, and doesn't this encourage self-help by people who feel that the sentence imposed is too light?
Oh, certainly, by the sounds of it, it's still far from over. Paul, talk us through the scenarios. What happens from here on? Should the state take it on appeal? We've already heard from the defense in this matter, Oscar Pistorius' lawyer, saying that they will not be appealing the sentence. So what happens to Oscar Pistorius in the interim?
Well, Oscar, if there's no appeal from Oscar's side, he starts to serve his sentence. If there is an appeal from the side of the state, then there will be an application for leave to appeal, and the judge has already indicated that she's available to hear such an application. If she grants the application, then the matter proceeds to the Supreme Court of Appeal, or possibly to the full bench of the High Court, and that appellate tribunal then considers sentencing afresh and decides whether or not a shockingly inappropriately light sentence has been imposed. And theoretically anyway, if somebody can persuade the Constitutional Court that the interest of justice will be served by having yet a further appeal, what comes out of the appeal process could eventually be ventilated in the Constitutional Court. Those are the avenues that are available. The appeal tribunals that are capable of being approached in a case like this are the full bench of the High Court in Pretoria, the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein, and if the interests of justice are served by so doing, the Constitutional Court in Braamfontein. So it's quite possible that having invested so much effort into this prosecution, the state will feel that it has had too small a return on its investment in the form of so light a sentence, and that Gerrie Nel will saddle up again and ride out in an effort to get a bigger sentence than what we've seen.
Advocate Paul Hoffman, thanks for your comprehensive analysis this morning. He is the Director of Accountability Now, speaking on our breaking news story this morning.